July 19, 1943, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Test pilot Major Mark Bradley climbed into the cockpit of an experimental fighter that wasn't supposed to exist. The P-51B Mustang sitting on the tarmac before him looked ordinary enough from the outside sleek aluminum skin, the distinctive scoop beneath the fuselage, the graceful laminar flow wings that gave it such speed. But behind Bradley's seat, where there should have been nothing but radio equipment and empty space, engineers had installed something that would either win the air war over Europe or kill every pilot who flew with it. An 85-gallon fuel tank, positioned exactly where physics said it shouldn't be. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were clear and unforgiving. 500 pounds of aviation fuel sitting 6 feet behind the pilot's position would shift the aircraft's center of gravity so far aft that the Mustang would become barely controllable. One wrong move at the wrong moment, a sharp turn with that tank still full, a sudden pull on the stick, and the aircraft would snap into an unrecoverable roll. The pilot wouldn't have time to understand what was happening before he was spiraling into the ground. Bradley knew this. The engineers at Wright Field knew this. Every aeronautical textbook ever written said this modification violated the fundamental principles of aircraft stability. And yet, on this sweltering summer morning in Ohio, they were going to test it anyway. Because without this modification, the daylight bombing campaign over Germany was bleeding to death, and no one had a better solution. 3 months earlier, on October 14, 1942, the mathematics of aerial warfare had written themselves in blood over the skies of Schweinfurt, Germany. Mission number 115. Target: the ball-bearing factories that kept German war production turning. 291 B-17 flying fortresses had departed from English air bases that morning, their crews understanding they were flying beyond the range of fighter escort. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolts that escorted them part of the way could only reach 375 miles from their bases before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line in the sky, the bombers were alone. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned to wait. They tracked the American formations on radar, watched the escort fighters turn away right on schedule, then came in for the kill. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190AS attacked in waves head-on passes with 20mm cannons, diving attacks from above, methodical destruction of aircraft that had nowhere to run. 60 B-17 seconds were shot down that day. 600 men are gone. 26% of the attacking force simply didn't come home. Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, ball turret gunner on a B-17 of the 100th Bomb Group, gave his testimony to intelligence officers after returning to Thorpe Abbotts. His words were recorded in the official after-action report, preserved now in the National Archives. The Germans waited until our escort turned back at Aachen. Then they came at us in waves for 3 hours straight. We had no protection. We were sitting ducks. In the operations room at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, Colonel Hubert Zemke stood before the mission board, watching the loss reports accumulate. The mathematics were unsustainable. At this attrition rate, the entire heavy bomber force would be destroyed before it could cripple German war production. The strategic bombing campaign, the foundation of American and British plans to defeat Germany, was on the verge of collapse. The problem was simple to state and seemingly impossible to solve. The distance from English air bases to key targets deep in Germany measured approximately 560 miles. A fighter aircraft needed to carry enough fuel not just to fly there and back 1,120 miles round trip, but also to engage in combat at the target, pursuing and destroying German interceptors while providing protection for the bombers. Combat operations consumed fuel at rates 2 to 3 times higher than cruise flight. No single-engine fighter in service with the 8th Air Force in late 1943 had that capability. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powered by its massive radial engine, was a formidable fighter but drank fuel at prodigious rates. Even with external drop tanks, its combat radius topped out around 450 miles. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and distinctive twin-boom design, had better range. But there weren't enough P-38 seconds in England to provide adequate escort. Most had been sent to North Africa earlier in the year and wouldn't return to English skies until September. The Supermarine Spitfire, the RAF's legendary fighter, was a short-range interceptor designed for the defence of Britain, not for penetration missions into Germany. The bombers continued to die, mission after mission. Formations returned with empty positions where aircraft had been shot down, with wounded and dead crew members, with battle damage that made some planes barely flyable. Loss rates of 5 to 10% per mission were common. At that rate, bomber crews faced mathematical certainty. They wouldn't survive their required 25 mission tours. At North American Aviation's facilities in Inglewood, California, a different kind of pressure was being built. The company had designed the P-51 Mustang originally for British requirements in 1940, and it had proven to be an exceptional aircraft, fast, maneuverable, with beautiful handling characteristics. But it was powered by an Allison V1710 engine that performed poorly at high altitude. The Mustang was relegated to low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack missions, where its superb aerodynamics and efficient engine made it valuable, but it couldn't compete with German fighters at the 25,000 to 30,000 foot altitudes where the bombers operated. Then, in late 1942, British testing proved what Rolls-Royce engineers had suspected. Install a Merlin engine in the Mustang, and everything changed. The Merlin 61, with its two-stage supercharger, gave the aircraft blistering performance at high altitude. Suddenly the Mustang could outrun and outmaneuver both the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 above 20,000 feet. The combination of North American's aerodynamically efficient airframe and Rolls-Royce's powerful engine created what test pilots were calling the finest fighter aircraft of the war. But the new P-51B, powered by the Packard-built Merlin-designated V1650, still had the same fundamental limitation as every other single-engine fighter: fuel capacity. The original design incorporated 184 gallons of fuel in the wings, 92 gallons in each wing tank, positioned between the forward and aft spars. This was actually exceptional for a fighter of its size. Most contemporary fighters stored their fuel in fuselage tanks. The wing-mounted fuel was a brilliant design decision by the North American engineering team, as it kept the weight distributed along the strong wing structure and minimized the impact on center of gravity. With 184 gallons of internal fuel and two 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could fly escort missions of about 750 miles round-trip. This was significantly better than the P-47, but still woefully short of what was needed for Berlin missions or for deep penetrations into southern Germany to target the oil refineries and aircraft factories that kept the Luftwaffe operational. The solution seemed obvious: add more fuel. But where? In July 1943, the United States Army Air Forces issued a directive to all fighter manufacturers: maximize internal fuel capacity. It was a response to the mounting bomber losses, a recognition that the escort fighter problem had to be solved or the strategic bombing campaign would fail. At North American Aviation, engineers examined the P-51B's fuselage, looking for space. The obvious location was directly behind the pilot's seat, in a section of fuselage currently occupied only by radio equipment and structural members. The space was there. An 85-gallon self-sealing fuel tank could be installed without major structural modifications. The plumbing could be routed to the existing fuel system. It was mechanically straightforward, but it was aerodynamically terrifying. The center of gravity of an aircraft is the point where all its weight could be considered to be concentrated. For stable, controllable flight, this center of gravity must be located within a specific range relative to the wing's center of lift. Too far forward, and the aircraft becomes heavy on the nose, difficult to rotate for takeoff, and sluggish in pitch. Too far aft, and the aircraft becomes unstable, the tail loses its authority, and the plane can snap into uncontrollable rolls or spins with little warning. The P-51B's center of gravity, with 184 gallons in the wings, was positioned well within the acceptable range. The wing tanks were located close to the aircraft's natural center of gravity, so even as fuel was consumed during flight, the CG didn't shift dramatically. But 85 gallons of fuel positioned 6 feet behind the pilot's seat was a different matter entirely. 85 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline weighed approximately 510 pounds. That mass, located so far aft, would shift the center of gravity rearward by several inches, pushing it dangerously, close to, or possibly beyond, the aft limit for safe flight. The calculations were performed and reperformed by engineers at Wright Field and at North American Aviation. The numbers were unambiguous. With the fuselage tank full, the P-51B's center of gravity would move to within 1 inch of the absolute aft limit. Handling would be degraded, stick forces would be very light, pilots would have to be extremely careful with control inputs, and most critically, violent maneuvers would be extremely dangerous. A hard pull on the stick, the kind of instinctive reaction a pilot might make when bounced by enemy fighters, could result in a snap roll from which recovery would be impossible. Every aeronautical engineer trained in aircraft stability knew this was a bad idea. The modification violated fundamental design principles. Locating fuel tanks far from the center of gravity was exactly what you didn't do if you wanted a stable, safe aircraft. But the alternative was watching bomber crews die by the hundreds because they had no fighter protection deep over Germany. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Army Air Forces. The 85-gallon fuselage tank would be installed, but with strict operational restrictions. Pilots would be required to burn fuel from the fuselage tank first, before engaging in any combat operations. The external drop tanks would be used for the mid-portion of the flight. By the time the aircraft reached the combat zone, the fuselage tank should be down to less than 25 gallons, at which point the center of gravity would be back within safer limits. Only then could pilots engage in violent maneuvers. It was a compromise born of desperation. The modification would give the Mustang the range to reach Berlin and back, but it would also create a window of vulnerability the first hour or more of flight, when the fuselage tank was full and the aircraft was marginally stable. During that period, if German fighters intercepted the formation, P-51 pilots would have to choose, engage and risk uncontrollable flight characteristics, or maintain fuel discipline and leave the bombers vulnerable. Major Mark Bradley's test flight on July 19, 1943, was the first time anyone would actually fly a P-51B with the full 85-gallon fuselage tank installed. The aircraft was redesignated P-51B5NA, the fifth production block, and this was acceptance testing for a modification that would be retrofitted to earlier aircraft and incorporated into all future production. Bradley had a distinguished background as a test pilot. He'd flown dozens of experimental aircraft types, evaluated new designs, tested modifications. He understood aircraft stability theory. He knew what the numbers said about this particular modification, and he understood that theory and practice don't always align perfectly. Sometimes you have to fly the aircraft to know how it really behaves. The ground crew had fueled the new tank to capacity that morning, 510 pounds of fuel sitting 6 feet behind where Bradley would sit. He performed his pre-flight inspection with extra care, checking control surface movement, examining the new fuel lines and connections, verifying that all the installation work had been done correctly. The engine start was normal. The Packard Merlin caught smoothly, settled into its characteristic rumble. Bradley taxied to the runway, running through mental checklists, preparing for an experience that no pilot had yet had. The tower cleared him for takeoff, throttle forward. The Merlin's power pushed him back in his seat. The tail came up at normal speed, and then, as the airspeed climbed through 70 miles per hour and Bradley applied back pressure to rotate for takeoff, he felt it immediately. The aircraft was reluctant to leave the ground. The nose wanted to stay down. He had to pull harder on the stick than normal, and even then, the rotation was sluggish. The P-51B lifted off, but it felt wrong heavy, tail heavy, like the aft end wanted to keep going when he tried to level off. He climbed carefully to altitude, avoiding any abrupt control inputs. At 5,000 feet, he began the test sequence, methodical evaluation of handling characteristics. Straight and level flight was acceptable, though the stick forces were noticeably lighter than in a standard P-51B. A gentle turn to the left manageable, but he could feel the reduced stability. A slightly steeper turn, and there it was. The warning. The aircraft's response wasn't quite predictable. There was a looseness to it, a feeling that the plane was on the edge of departure from controlled flight. Bradley eased out of the turn, made notes on his kneeboard. He tried some stalls, carefully, ready to recover at the first sign of a snap. The stall characteristics were significantly degraded with the full fuselage tank. The aircraft wanted to drop a wing suddenly rather than stalling straight ahead. Then he performed the test that everyone was most concerned about, a simulated combat maneuver, a hard pull into a climbing turn, the kind of move you'd make if bounced by enemy fighters from above. He set up carefully, made sure he had plenty of altitude for recovery if things went wrong, then pulled hard on the stick. The P-51B snapped into a roll so fast, Bradley barely had time to register what was happening. The horizon spun. He released back pressure immediately, neutralized the controls, and the aircraft recovered, but it had been a near thing. If he'd been at lower altitude, if his reactions had been even fractionally slower, the test flight would have ended in an augured hole in the Ohio countryside. He landed 40 minutes later and filed his report. The modification was flyable, but only with extreme care. Combat operations with a full fuselage tank would be suicidal. Pilots would have to burn that fuel down to less than 25 gallons before engaging in any aggressive maneuvering. The Army Air Forces accepted these limitations. Installation kits were prepared and shipped to England beginning in September 1943. The first long-range P-51B with the fuselage tank installed was accepted in December. By early 1944, the modification was being incorporated on the production line, and retrofit kits were being installed on aircraft already in service. Pilots received new training on fuel management procedures. The doctrine was specific and non-negotiable. For a mission to Berlin or other distant targets, the fuel sequence would be: start the mission drawing from the fuselage tank, burn it down to 25 gallons or less during the climb and outbound leg, switch to the drop tanks for the mid-portion of the flight, drop the external tanks before entering the combat zone, use the wing tanks for combat operations and the return flight, with the remaining fuel in the fuselage tank held as emergency reserve. Violate this sequence, and you were flying an unstable aircraft into combat. The warnings were explicit. Multiple pilot training documents, now preserved in the Air Corps Library, contain variations of the same critical notice. Maneuvers restricted until fuselage tank down to 25 gallons. A full tank creates a dangerous aft center of gravity. Snap rolls may occur with abrupt control inputs. First Lieutenant Gordon Graham, who flew P-51Bs with the 354th Fighter Group, later recalled in interviews with Air Force historians. They told us repeatedly, burn that fuselage tank first, no matter what. If you got bounced by 109s before you'd burned it down, you had two choices: run away or die. You couldn't dogfight with 500 pounds of fuel behind your head. The plane would snap on you, and that was it. The first operational units to receive the modified P-51Bs were still undergoing training and shakedown when the next disaster struck. Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944. 6 days of maximum effort bombing raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to produce replacement fighters. The cost was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters during those 6 days. Over 2,200 aircrew members were killed, wounded, or captured. Some missions had loss rates exceeding 25%. And many of those losses occurred because fighter escorts, even the new P-51Bs with extended range, still couldn't provide continuous protection over the entire mission profile. But the new Mustangs were beginning to demonstrate what they could do. On several missions during Big Week, P-51 seconds with the fuselage tanks and external drop tanks provided escort much deeper into Germany than had been possible before. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting encounters with American fighters at locations previously considered safe. The invisible line in the sky, the point beyond which bombers were unescorted, was moving deeper into German territory. On March 4, 1944, that line was erased completely. Debden Airfield, Essex, England, 0900 hours. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, stood in the operations room and looked at the mission map. A red ribbon stretched from Debden across the North Sea, across occupied Holland, across Germany, all the way to Berlin, 1,160 miles round trip. The bomber crews called it Big B, the German capital, the heart of the Reich. No American fighter had ever escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The official intelligence assessment, based on analysis of fighter fuel capacity and combat radius calculations, was that it was impossible. Single-engine fighters simply couldn't carry enough fuel, but Blakesley and his pilots were about to prove that assessment wrong, because they had something the intelligence officers hadn't fully accounted for: P-51B Mustangs with 184 gallons in the wings, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank, and two 108-gallon paper drop tanks under the wings. Total fuel capacity, 485 gallons. With careful fuel management, proper power settings, and the Merlin engine's excellent fuel efficiency, that was enough to fly to Berlin, fight over the target, and fly home, just barely, with very little margin for error. But enough. The briefing was straightforward. Weather was marginal, always a concern, as poor visibility could cause bombers to miss their assembly points, but it would also hinder German fighters. The route was planned to avoid known concentrations of flak, and the fuel management was critical. "Burn your fuselage tanks on the way out," Blakesley told his pilots. "By the time we cross into Germany, I want those tanks down to reserve. Switch to your drop tanks over Holland. You'll punch those off when we hit the initial point. After that, you're on wing tanks all the way home. Manage your fuel. Manage your power settings. Do not get into extended dogfights unless you're certain you have the fuel reserves." The pilots filed out to their aircraft. Ground crews had been working since 0300, fueling the new paper drop tanks, performing final checks. The P-51Bs sat on the hard stands, sleek and deadly, each one carrying enough fuel to attempt what everyone had said was impossible. Lieutenant William Overstreet of the 357th Fighter Group performed his pre-flight checks, his hands moving through the familiar sequence. He opened the fuel selector and verified it was set to draw from the fuselage tank first. That tank had been topped off just before dawn, 85 gallons of high-octane fuel sitting directly behind his seat. He knew what that meant for the aircraft's handling. He'd been through the training, first hour of flight, keep it smooth, no aggressive maneuvering. The Merlins coughed to life across the airfield, dozens of fighters starting in sequence. The distinctive sound of 6,100 cubic-inch V12 engines at idle created a rumble that vibrated the ground. One by one, the P-51 seconds taxied to the runway. Overstreet lined up, completed his before-takeoff checks, and waited for the green light from the tower. When it came, he advanced the throttle smoothly. The Merlin's power built, the acceleration was slower than normal. The added weight of all that fuel meant a longer takeoff roll, but the airspeed climbed through 70, then 80, then 100 miles per hour. He pulled back on the stick carefully, remembering the test pilot reports about reduced elevator authority with the full fuselage tank. The nose lifted, the main gear left the runway. The P-51B climbed into the grey English morning, heavy with fuel, flying to a city 13 years earlier. No one had thought reachable by single-engine fighters based in England. The formation assembled over the English Channel, dozens of P-51Bs joining into combat boxes, weaving patterns in the sky as they found their positions. Each pilot was acutely aware of the fuel flowing from that aft fuselage tank, the weight slowly diminishing, the centre of gravity gradually shifting forward into the safe range. It would take approximately an hour of flight to burn down to 25 gallons, at which point the aircraft would handle normally again. During that hour, they were vulnerable, not just to enemy fighters. Any interception during the first leg of the mission would force impossible choices, but to the aircraft themselves. The P-51B with a full fuselage tank didn't fly like the Mustang pilots had trained on. It was a different airplane, requiring constant attention, smooth inputs, no sudden movements. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group later described the sensation in his combat memoir. Flying with that fuselage tank full was like balancing a pencil on your finger. Everything had to be gentle. You couldn't horse the controls around. I saw one pilot in training get impatient during a turn, yanked the stick, and snap-rolled right into the ground. After that, everyone believed the warnings. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 12,000 feet, climbing steadily. The bomber stream was ahead and above, B-17 seconds in their combat boxes, hundreds of aircraft heading toward Germany. The P-51 seconds were their shield now, the escort that could go all the way. Overstreet checked his fuel selector. The fuselage tank was down to approximately 40 gallons. Another 15 minutes and he could switch to the drop tanks. He scanned the sky constantly above, behind, to the sides. The Luftwaffe had radar installations all along the coast. The question was where and when the German fighters would appear. At 10:45 hours, the radio crackled with the first contact report. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, several groups. The Luftwaffe was rising to meet them, but the P-51 seconds couldn't engage yet. Not until those fuselage tanks were down to safe levels. The bomber escort doctrine held. Maintain position, protect the bombers, don't get drawn into individual dogfights unless absolutely necessary. The German fighters came in cautiously at first, probing attacks, trying to assess this new situation. They'd seen P-51 seconds before, but never this far into Germany. Their intelligence had been clear. American single-engine fighters couldn't reach this deep. Yet, here they were. Dozens of Mustangs at 28,000 feet over Brunswick, still climbing, still accompanying the bombers. Major Walter Novotny, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, would later report to Luftwaffe High Command his confusion during this engagement. The after-action reports, captured after the war and now stored in the Bundesarchiv, record his assessment. American fighters present in strength over Brunswick and continuing eastward. This contradicts all previous intelligence regarding enemy fighter radius of action. Engagement inconclusive as enemy fighters maintained formation discipline. By 1100 hours, Overstreet had burned his fuselage tank down to 25 gallons and switched to his drop tanks. The aircraft handled normally now. The deadly vulnerability of that first hour was past. He tested the controls' crisp response, no looseness, no warning signs of instability. The P-51B was itself again, the magnificent fighter that test pilots raved about. The formation continued east. The drop tanks, those remarkable cylinders of compressed paper and resin, fed fuel steadily to the Merlin engines. Each tank held 108 gallons. With two tanks, that was 216 additional gallons beyond the internal fuel. The mathematics of range were now in the Americans' favor. At 11:30 hours, the radio call came that would echo through aviation history. Big B at 12 o'clock, 30 miles. Berlin, the target that everyone said was unreachable, and American fighters were seeing it for the first time. The bomber crews saw it too. Technical Sergeant Dale Rice, ball turret gunner on a B-17 of the 100th Bomb Group, later provided testimony to the official debriefing team. We were approaching the initial point when I saw P-51 seconds at our altitude with contrails streaming. One waggled its wings as it passed over us. I could see the drop tanks under the wings. I knew then we were going to make it. We had fighter cover all the way to Berlin. The Luftwaffe came into force now. This was the Reich capital. Defense was mandatory regardless of fuel expenditure or pilot losses. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove from altitude, climbing from below, attacking from the sun. The aerial battle developed with savage intensity. Colonel Blakesley's voice cut through the radio chatter. Drop tanks, all fighters, drop tanks, and engage. Across the formation, P-51 pilots pulled the release levers. 216 pounds of weight fell away from each aircraft, empty paper cylinders tumbling through the sky to land in German fields and forests below. The Mustangs were lighter now, more maneuverable, ready for combat. What happened over Berlin that afternoon changed the aerial war fundamentally. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes, an eternity in air combat. P-51 seconds and German fighters swirled in dogfights at altitudes from 20,000 to 32,000 feet. The Mustangs proved their worth. At high altitude, they were faster than the Bf-109G and more maneuverable than the WWII. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and the presence of adequate fuel reserves allowed American pilots to engage aggressively. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 356th Fighter Squadron, 354th Fighter Group, flying P-51B, serial number 43-6315, found himself separated from his formation and faced with German fighters attacking a bomber group. Rather than conserving fuel and withdrawing, Howard had the range to stay and fight. He engaged multiple German fighters over a 15-minute period, shooting down 3 and damaging several others, continuing to defend the bombers even when his guns malfunctioned. For this action, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the award for a single mission. His citation noted specifically that he was able to maintain combat operations deep over Germany because his aircraft had sufficient fuel reserves. The extended range provided by the fuselage tank and drop tanks made the difference between a brief engagement before fuel exhaustion forced withdrawal and sustained combat operations that could decisively protect the bomber formation. The bombers completed their run over Berlin, dropped their ordnance, and turned for home. The P-51 seconds maintained escort, fighting off continued German attacks. As the formation exited German airspace, Overstreet checked his fuel gauges. Wing tanks showed approximately 110 gallons remaining. The fuselage tank still had its 25-gallon reserve, more than enough to make it home with margin for error. The March 4th mission had been hampered by weather. Only 32 bombers reached Berlin due to cloud cover and navigation difficulties. But the strategic message was unmistakable. American fighters had reached the German capital. This was not a fluke or a one-time penetration with perfect conditions. It was a sustainable operational capability. 2 days later, on March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin with 662 bombers and approximately 150 P-51 Mustangs, plus P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts in supporting roles. The weather was better, the execution was more refined, and the Luftwaffe faced a situation they had not anticipated. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded in his diary that evening, a diary recovered after the war and later published, "They told us the American fighters couldn't reach Berlin. They said the range was impossible for single-engine aircraft. But today I fought Mustangs over the city, and they were at full combat capability. They weren't conserving fuel or withdrawing. They had reserves. Everything we were told was wrong." General der Jagdflieger Adolf Garland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces with over 104 victories, flew combat missions during this period despite his administrative position. His combat assessments, submitted through official channels and preserved in Luftwaffe records, noted repeatedly that American fighters were operating at full capability over Berlin, engaging aggressively with no apparent fuel conservation behavior. This contradicted everything Luftwaffe intelligence believed about American fighter capabilities. The analysis had been based on earlier encounters with P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds, both of which had demonstrated limited penetration into German airspace before fuel constraints forced them back. The Germans had built their defensive strategy around this limitation. Fighter units were positioned in rings around Germany, with the understanding that American escorts would turn back at predictable points, leaving the bombers vulnerable. That strategy was now obsolete. The technical examination of captured P-51 seconds would reveal to German engineers how the Americans had achieved this range. When German intelligence officers examined the wreckage of P-51 seconds shot down during the Berlin missions, they found evidence of the internal fuselage tank. Initial assessments questioned whether such a modification was even safe. German aeronautical engineers understood the center of gravity implications immediately. A technical intelligence report dated March 15, 1944, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, analyzed a captured P-51B and concluded, aircraft incorporates internal fuselage fuel tanks of approximately 320 litres capacity positioned aft of the cockpit. This placement would create significant aft centre of gravity movement when the tank is full. American pilots must operate under strict fuel management protocols to maintain stability. That they accept these limitations demonstrates the critical importance they place on extended range capability. The German analysis was exactly correct. American pilots were operating under strict protocols, accepting significant risks during the first hour of flight, because the alternative leaving bombers unescorted deep over Germany was unacceptable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The impact on bomber loss rates was immediate and dramatic. In October 1943, before long-range escort was available, the 8th Air Force experienced monthly loss rates of approximately 7.6% of aircraft dispatched. Individual missions like Schweinfurt reached 20.6% losses. These rates were catastrophic and unsustainable. By April 1944, after P-51 seconds with extended range became available in significant numbers, the overall campaign loss rate had dropped to between 1.5 and 2.2%. This reduction saved thousands of aircrew lives and made the strategic bombing campaign sustainable for the remainder of the war. The human cost of the earlier period before the range extension modification was staggering. In the 4 months from August through November 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 886 heavy bombers in combat. At 10 crew members per bomber, that represented 8,860 men killed, wounded, or captured in just 4 months. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, a B-17 pilot with the 379th Bomb Group, flew missions both before and after effective long-range escort became available. His testimony, recorded in the official Strategic Bombing Survey, was stark. Before the P-51 seconds could go all the way, every mission was a nightmare. You knew the fighters would leave you somewhere over Germany, and after that, it was just survival. When the Mustangs started appearing over the target and staying with us all the way home, it changed everything. We could actually focus on hitting the target instead of just trying to stay alive. The engineering decision to accept the risks of the aft fuselage tank had enabled this transformation. But the risks remained real. Pilots who forgot the fuel management protocols, who engaged in violent maneuvers with the fuselage, tank still full, paid the ultimate price. On April 7, 1944, Lieutenant Richard Anders of the 355th Fighter Group was bounced by Bf-109s shortly after takeoff on a mission to central Germany. His fuselage tank was still nearly full. Rather than evading and running until he could burn down the fuel, Anders turned hard into the attack. Witnesses saw his P-51B snap into an inverted spin at 3,000 feet. He didn't recover. The aircraft augured straight into the ground near the Dutch border. The accident investigation report, preserved in Air Force historical records, concluded, pilot initiated aggressive combat maneuver with fuselage fuel tank at approximately 75 gallons. Aircraft departed controlled flight consistent with aft CG instability. No mechanical failure. Pilot error failure to follow prescribed fuel management procedures. Anders was 22 years old. He was not the only casualty of the fuselage tank's handling characteristics, but such incidents were relatively rare. Most pilots followed the procedures meticulously because they understood the consequences of deviation. The training emphasized repeatedly that the first hour of flight required discipline, no heroics, no aggressive maneuvering, just steady progress toward the point where the fuel level brought the center of gravity back into the safe range. By summer 1944, the combination of P-51Bs and P-51Ds with fuselage tanks, plus the availability of both 75-gallon and 108-gallon drop tanks, gave the 8th Air Force complete flexibility in mission planning. No target in Germany was beyond the range of fighter escort, oil refineries in Romania, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, aircraft production facilities in Regensburg, marshalling yards in Munich, Messerschmitt works in Augsburg. All were now reachable with continuous fighter protection. The Luftwaffe's loss rates climbed catastrophically. In June 1944, approximately 350-day fighters were lost defending the Reich. In July, losses exceeded 350 single-engine fighters in the West alone, representing a 31.2% monthly attrition rate. August saw similar losses with a 36% attrition rate. At these loss rates, experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The replacement pilots arriving from training schools had perhaps 150 hours of flight time compared to 300 hours or more for American pilots. Many German replacement pilots had as little as 30 hours in type before being assigned to operational squadrons. The experience gap combined with numerical inferiority and the constant presence of P-51 escorts made daylight operations over Germany increasingly deadly for the Luftwaffe. Galland submitted repeated assessments to Hitler and senior Wehrmacht leadership throughout this period. His September 1944 report stated the situation bluntly. The Luftwaffe could not win the air war. Germany lacked the resources, the fuel, the aircraft, and the trained pilots necessary to contest Allied air superiority. The Americans could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Their industrial capacity was beyond Germany's ability to counter through combat operations. The only viable strategy was to husband remaining resources for defense of critical targets and hope for political settlement before complete collapse. The engineering decision made in July 1943 to accept the risks of an aft fuselage fuel tank in exchange for extended range had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate technical specifications. It enabled a campaign of systematic destruction that crippled German war production and devastated the Luftwaffe through sustained attrition. But it's important to understand that the fuselage tank was only one element of a comprehensive solution. The P-51's extended range capability resulted from multiple factors working together. The efficient laminar flow wing design by North American Aviation's team, led by Edgar Schmood, the fuel-efficient Merlin engine with its two-stage supercharger, the wing tanks holding 184 gallons positioned close to the center of gravity, the fuselage tank adding 85 gallons despite the stability challenges, and the drop tanks, both metal and paper, providing additional range extension. The drop tanks themselves deserve recognition. The paper drop tanks, manufactured primarily by Lloyd in Britain, were engineering marvels in their own right. Constructed from laminated kraft paper impregnated with phenolic resin, they could hold 108 gallons of fuel, function perfectly at altitudes up to 40,000 feet in temperatures ranging from -60 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, and cost a fraction of metal tanks to produce. Master Sergeant Donald Mather of the 357th Fighter Group, responsible for drop tank logistics at Leiston Airfield, kept detailed records of tank usage. His logs show that from March through August 1944, his squadron alone used over 2,000 paper drop tanks without a single failure attributable to tank construction. The tanks were filled immediately before takeoff. The resin would slowly dissolve from fuel exposure over several hours used during the mission, then jettisoned before combat. Simple, effective, and produced in quantities that would have been impossible with metal construction. The fuel management procedures developed for the Berlin missions became standard doctrine for all long-range escort operations. The sequence was codified in Tactical Order 62, issued by 8th Air Force Headquarters in March 1944 and preserved in the National Archives. All pilots will burn fuselage tank fuel during climb and initial leg of mission. Fuselage tanks will be reduced to 25 gallons or less before entering the combat zone. Drop tanks will be used for the cruise phase, wing tanks reserved for combat operations and return flight. Deviation from this sequence is prohibited. The order had the force of a direct command. Violations were treated as breaches of discipline, subject to court-martial in extreme cases. The Air Force could not afford to lose pilots and aircraft to handling accidents caused by improper fuel management. First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group flew one of the longest-range missions of the war on October 7, 1944. Escorting bombers to Ploiesti near the Polish border, a round trip of approximately 1,400 miles, he took off with full internal fuel plus two 108-gallon drop tanks. The mission profile required precise fuel management, fuselage tank down to reserve during climb, drop tanks for the long cruise to Poland, wing tanks for combat and return. After dropping his tanks, Drew encountered and shot down two Messerschmitt Me-262s, becoming one of the first pilots to destroy the revolutionary German jets. He returned to base with approximately 40 gallons remaining in his wing tanks, enough fuel for perhaps 20 minutes of flight. The mission had pushed the P-51's range to its absolute limit, but it demonstrated what the combination of fuselage tank, drop tanks, and careful fuel management could achieve. The post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey documented the impact of long-range fighter escorts with brutal clarity. The survey team, which included civilian economists and military analysts, examined captured German production records, interviewed surviving Luftwaffe personnel, and calculated the effectiveness of various aspects of the bombing campaign. Their conclusion regarding fighter escort was unambiguous. The development and deployment of auxiliary fuel tanks, particularly the 85-gallon fuselage tank in the P-51B and subsequent variants, extended fighter escort range from 475 miles to 850 miles. This 79% increase in range brought every target in Germany within escort capability. The resulting reduction in bomber losses saved approximately 8,000 aircrew lives during 1944 and enabled the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives. 8,000 lives. That was the measurable human cost avoided by the decision to accept the risks of the aft fuselage tank. 8,000 young men who would have died in burning bombers over Germany, but instead survived because P-51 seconds could escort them all the way to the target and back. The technical specifications of the P-51D, the most produced variant incorporating all the refinements learned from the B and C models, tell the story in numbers. 184 gallons in wing tanks, 85 gallons in fuselage tank, 216 gallons in external drop tanks, two 108-gallon tanks, total fuel capacity, 485 gallons. Combat radius with this configuration, 880 miles. Maximum range at optimal cruise settings, over 2,000 miles. But the raw numbers don't capture the human experience, the discipline required to fly that first hour with a full fuselage tank, the constant mental calculations about fuel state and center of gravity, the awareness that a moment of carelessness could result in an unrecoverable snap roll. Captain Donald Gentile, who flew with the 4th Fighter Group and became one of the war's top aces with 21.8 victories, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in a letter home to his family in April 1944. The Mustang is the finest fighter plane I've ever flown, but it demands respect. We carry so much fuel now that we can go anywhere in Germany, but you have to manage it carefully. The first hour of every mission, I'm thinking about that fuselage tank. Once it's burned down, I can fight. But until then, I'm just trying to stay alive and not do anything stupid. The fuselage tank killed some pilots through handling accidents. It saved thousands more by making long-range escort possible. That was the bargain. And it was a bargain the Army Air Forces accepted because the alternative continuing unescorted bombing with catastrophic loss rates was worse. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was absolute. Only 2 German aircraft appeared over the Normandy beaches during the invasion. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies in 1940, was reduced to token resistance. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the systematic destruction of production facilities had crippled German air power. The P-51 Mustang played a crucial role in this transformation, but not because it was a revolutionary design or because it incorporated exotic technology. The Mustang succeeded because it combined good engineering with pragmatic compromises. The fuselage tank was dangerous but flyable with proper procedures. The drop tanks were expendable, but that made them manufacturable in vast quantities. The overall design prioritized range and high-altitude performance, accepting trade-offs in other areas. This philosophy of practical compromise extended to production methods. North American aviation designed the P-51 for mass production from the outset. Parts were interchangeable. Assembly line techniques reduced construction time. At peak production in 1944, North American's Inglewood plant in California averaged approximately 364 Mustangs per month. The Dallas plant contributed additional production. Combined output across both facilities reached approximately 574 P-51 seconds per month during 1944, with peak monthly production of 881 aircraft in January 1945. Over 15,469 P-51 Mustangs were produced during the war and immediately afterward. This scale of production meant that losses could be replaced rapidly, that damaged aircraft could be retired rather than painstakingly rebuilt, that operational units always had sufficient aircraft available. The contrast with German production methods was stark. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf combined produced approximately 600 fighters per month in early 1944. Despite operating under emergency priority programs and utilizing forced labor, German aircraft production could not match American output. The industrial disparity determined the war's outcome as surely as any battle. The pilots who flew the long-range missions understood what they were accomplishing. They were winning a war of attrition not through superior individual skill, though many American pilots were highly skilled, but through systematic application of resources. Every mission wore down the Luftwaffe a little more. Every German pilot lost was increasingly difficult to replace. Every combat engagement deep over Germany demonstrated that American fighters had the range, the fuel, and the numbers to appear anywhere, anytime. Major George Preddy, leading ace of the 8th Air Force with 26.8 victories, flew his most successful mission on August 6, 1944. Leading the 352nd Fighter Group to a target in northern Germany, he shot down 6 German fighters in a single engagement, becoming one of only a handful of pilots to achieve ace-in-a-day status. His aircraft that day was a P-51D with full internal fuel plus drop tanks. The extended range gave him the fuel reserves to pursue multiple engagements over a 15-minute period without concern about having enough fuel to return home. His after-action report, preserved in Air Force records, noted, "With proper fuel management, the P-51 gives us the ability to fight anywhere in Germany and still have reserves for the flight home. This is a decisive advantage. The German pilots know they're defending their own territory, but they also know we can stay and fight as long as necessary." By autumn 1944, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The question was no longer whether Allied bombers could reach targets in Germany. They could, with fighter escort throughout the mission. The question was how quickly the systematic destruction of German war production would force surrender. The bombing campaign continued with increasing intensity through the winter of 1944 into 1945. Oil refineries, transportation networks, aircraft factories, and industrial centers were hit repeatedly. The cumulative effect, combined with Soviet advances from the east and Allied advances from the west, brought Germany to collapse by May 1945. The P-51 Mustang continued in service for decades after World War II. The aircraft saw extensive combat in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, primarily in ground attack and close air support roles. The excellent range and endurance that had made it an outstanding escort fighter in Europe proved equally valuable in Korea's different operating environment. P-51 seconds remained in frontline service with some air forces into the early 1980s, testament to the soundness of the basic design. Today, over 100 P-51 seconds remain airworthy, maintained by collectors and museums worldwide. The sight and sound of a Mustang in flight, the distinctive sound of the Merlin engine, the graceful lines of the laminar flow wings, the purposeful elegance of a design perfected for its mission serves as a reminder of what American engineering and industrial capacity achieved during the war. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to the P-51 and its fuselage tank modification is found not in museums or air shows, but in the simple fact of survival. 8,000 bomber crew members who would have died in unescorted missions over Germany instead came home. They married, raised families, built careers, lived long lives, all because American fighters could escort them to Berlin and back. The engineering decision made in July 1943 to install an 85-gallon fuel tank in a location that violated every principle of aircraft stability and to accept the handling risks in exchange for extended range enabled that survival. It was a desperate solution to a desperate problem, a calculated risk that could have gone wrong in countless ways. It worked, and in war, that's what matters most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.